So I'm going to
So,
start Damon's video, and
and
Helena, you can
Damon,
give Damon a brief introduction.
yeah, Damon, welcome. I can't see you, but there you are. And
Morning.
so, for those of you who don't know Damon, he's best known for having produced that amazing film, That Sugar Film, which reached the whole world and had an impact on policy around the world in terms of sugar consumption. And then recently, he made the film 2040, which equally is reaching the entire world with a very important message about climate change. And he's much more than a filmmaker. He's one of the really bright and very powerful voices around the world now, passionately committed to trying to bring about change. So welcome, Damon.
Thank you for having me. And hi, Charles. I really enjoyed that discussion. So thanks for being a part of this as well.
Yeah, thanks.
So Damon, Charles and I, in the beginning, would probably have been a bit skeptical that your film was perhaps a bit too much of a techno vision of the future. What would you say to that?
Well, I guess regenerative agriculture is a technology of sorts, but I'd say it's a biological technology that's probably the most exciting and is going to offer the most cascading benefits to society. So I guess it's a technology in one way, but I don't see it that way, and neither do I see the seaweed sequestration element and how they can regenerate the oceans. I guess they are technologies, but I think they're natural ones. They're very different to giant machines that would suck carbon out of the atmosphere on the edge of our cities, which I'm certainly opposed to. So, yeah, there were elements in the film, but the technology I tried to explore were ones that were decentralizing. So the energy, the microgrid setup, I think, from my point of view, is an intelligent use of technology. I don't think we should put a black and white statement saying all tech is bad. I think there are elements that it can be very useful. We're seeing that even now, as our system feels these shocks, that there are people using the internet in very intelligent ways. We are about to release a video which allows people to connect with other people growing food in their community to see who is growing food. They can then hook up as a network and start to share, exchange that food. So someone that might be growing basil can then do an exchange with someone who has carrots in their area. So to me, that's a smart use of technology and makes the process easier for where we're at right now. And I think that's really important, that we can't just sort of forgo everything. We have to sort of meet the system where it's at, use the best bits of it in the ways we can, and then down the track discuss about what we move to. And I think that's very important right now, that I feel even a little reluctant having these discussions, because I think there are people around the world that are deeply traumatized at the moment. Whether it's an artificial crisis or not, that there is a reality for people right now. I saw some footage from some of the Italian hospitals this morning, and it's just chaotic in there. You know, they just are running out of respiratory devices. They're trying to decide who lives and dies. So as much as we can speculate on what this is all about, I think it's really important we honour where we're at right now, which is a bit of a triage situation and an emergency for a lot of people out there. The threat of losing their incomes, the threat of losing their loved ones, should be our primary concern as human beings before we start to discuss some of these huge systemic changes. And I think the time will come, and I think it will be a beautiful opportunity, as Charles mentioned. And I'm excited by that, but I'm also very cognizant of just making sure we honour where people are at right now and listen to them and make sure they get what they require.
Yes, I think maybe we should address a little more, as you say, the situation right now, although I feel that that's being done by so many people now. And, you know, it's, yeah. But I, you know, personally, I would be, of course, encouraging people to perhaps by joining others online, but, you know, this is a huge opportunity to slow down, which is also fertile ground for developing more of a spiritual practice. And I've been very, myself, I've been so helped by something called EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique, which involves tapping. And you can look it up on the web, particularly Dr. Mercola has a whole section on it. And it's also recently a scientist here, actually in Australia, has written a book about the science of tapping. It turns out that in scientific research, it's proven remarkably helpful as a way of essentially changing the narrative in our head away from a negative, fearful one, addiction, almost all our psychological problems can be greatly helped by this technique. And so this is now, a great need and an opportunity to learn about some of these practices. I mean, EFT is one that I strongly recommend. I also learned from the ancient Buddhist culture that their practice was one of very much moving in and out of just taking a deeper breath and letting the right side of the brain come more to the fore. In other words, stopping the chattering mind regularly over the day. I mean, they used to do it even in conversation. They would be saying, "Hi, Damon, how are you today?" And then they say, "Oh, Mani Padme Hum," as they would spin their prayer wheels. At that moment, they were in that meditative state. And by chanting, they were stimulating the vagus nerve, which now there's more and more evidence about this vitally important central nerve in our system, and that chanting and singing too stimulate it. So there are practices that don't have to involve sitting for an hour or even half an hour meditating, but very, things that you can carry out rather easily. And now is the time to learn about them.
Yeah, I would also offer that, that self-care is so crucial right now. We are just, there's just so much information flying around at the moment. Everyone wants to have a say. Everyone's got an opinion. It's a very polluted information environment. And I'd say that's contributing to a lot of people's anxiety, who to believe, who to trust. And that's a bigger conversation for later out of this, I think, is that how do we develop better ways of collectively making sense of things? Because I think this is really pushing up that as a barrier in our society right now. But I would also say that apart from that self-care, all the research says that a great way to alleviate any anxiety is to take action and try and help and reach out and connect in ways that you can. And we've actually put together a list at our 2040 website. We've sort of in pages, we've got a list of different organizations where people can get involved. It includes things like meal trains, so you can set up ways to deliver meals to people that might be in quarantine. There's the Good Karma Effect, which is a website that again allows you to set up and connect with other communities. Nextdoor is another app that allows you to connect with neighbours around you and share conversations and ideas and what might be happening in your community. So there's a few of those. If people want to get those tangible actions, they're on our social media channels, because that's the best way to help. And I'm finding that myself. Zoe and I, my wife, are reaching out in different ways to try and help our own community. There's a group sort of forming at the moment called Resilient Byron, which is where we live, about how do we actually create some infrastructures. I know this is your work as well, Helena. How do we set up groups that can facilitate helping, answering phone calls, delivering food, whatever it might be. And I'm finding that's giving me a lot of respite as well. But I would just warn people against spending too much time online, going down rabbit holes. There's all sorts of theories and speculations. I've heard any number of different reasons as to why coronavirus has been started. It can be very overwhelming. So I just probably suggest people to take care with some of that stuff. Some of it might have elements of truth, but there's a lot of it that doesn't. And I don't think it's serving us very well as communities.
Yeah, yes. I also see a lot of self-organizing groups, so we're also here in our neighborhood doing that, and really wonderful examples everywhere, people realizing that they need to reach out and support each other. So in that way, there are already so many good things coming out of this. And
there is, and you're not just, as you said, that there's so many good stories there, but even the sort of the ecological stories are quite interesting as well. And again, it's I step into this with great hesitancy because there is people experiencing trauma, but just to see, what's happened to the nitrogen dioxide levels across Europe and in China as well, and the air pollution, and even a Stanford study that came out last week saying that coronavirus in China has likely prevented 77,000 deaths because of the stop of production. So
wow.
Do with that what you will, but that is another sort of slight silver lining to what's going on. There's a lot of misinformation about, obviously, animals and Venice and whatnot, but there have definitely been fish and seaweed sighted in the Venice canals because the sediment has stopped being churned up by the boats and all the diesel engines there. So that was a quote from the Venice Mare there, that the canals are very clear for the first time, and they're quite beautiful pictures to look at and feel comforted in these difficult times. So there's more and more stories like that emerging of just showing us how powerful our system is and how deleterious it is on our planet. The danger is, I think we've already seen in China as their production started again, that those pollution levels can rise very quickly. We saw that after the GFC back in 2008, 2009, we had a drop of about 1% in global emissions at that time. But then because of the doubling down on the system and the stimulus packages to accelerate these large corporations again, our emissions went up nearly 5% the year after. So we do have some really important conversations to have when the time is right about what do we do moving forward, because we have governments in place in our country, in America, in the UK, that are likely to double down on the system. And that, as we know, could be quite disastrous for all sorts of ecological problems we're facing. So there's really interesting ideas to be discussed around universal basic incomes, around, if we're going to bail out these companies, should we take a share, take some of the profits as the public, so that if they do get back on their feet again, that we get a dividend as the public, given that it's our money that's going back into these corporations to get strong again. That's a really interesting discussion. We didn't do that in the GFC, and a lot of these companies and their CEOs have made far more money than they were making before. So I just really hope that when the time's right, that we learn from these lessons. We have some really serious and adult conversations about what a new system might look like, because as you and Charles have talked about, this is an opportunity. The door has pried open slightly, but we've just got to do it with compassion and care and make sure that we get the timing right.
Yeah, well, I hope that you will also be joining us to have discussions, over the next weeks. And I think even now, I think it would be wonderful if you could tell people more about your experience with regen agriculture and the impact of the film around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of the most exciting solutions I've seen in the last 5 years is, again, it comes back to this metaphor we've talked about before, that we've built this system at the moment that is based primarily on competition and rivalry and extraction. And agriculture is a great example of how we fight nature. We plant monocrops when nature thrives on diversity. We use chemicals to control weeds and pests and animals. And we constantly plow and till the soil, which breaks up all the life and the biota in that soil, but also releases carbon into the atmosphere. And that's a very aggressive fighting system, whereas regenerative agriculture really works with a more interconnected and symbiotic way of nature, that we actually try and put that carbon from the atmosphere back into the soil to kickstart all these living organisms that occur when you do that. And there's in a handful of soil, healthy soil, there's about 6 billion living organisms. And what they do is things like some of them have had antidepressant properties, but some also make these minerals bioavailable for the plant. So they solubilize the mineral and make them accessible to the plants. So we just can't have human health without plant health, and we can't have plant health without soil health. And lots of farmers are starting to realize that. Even the ones that are skeptical on climate change are still putting the carbon back in their soil for these benefits. And also then there's the water holding capacity, which I think is, apart from the healthy food element, how we deal with water moving forward. We are a blue planet, and a soil scientist told me that for every rainfall in Australia, if you could condense it down to just 100 drops, about 36 of those drops are going to transpiration of the trees. About 2 of those drops are caught in dams, but about 50 of those drops evaporate or run off our landscapes because the soil isn't healthy. So the way to move forward is not building more dams, which is what our governments are talking about at the moment. Even if we doubled them, we'd only be capturing 4 of those drops. It's actually about putting that carbon in the soil and creating the sponge that catches that water when it falls. So for every 1% of carbon that you add to 30 centimeters of soil, you increase that water holding capacity by about 160,000 litres of water on every rainfall. So it's just an extraordinary solution, and that's why so many people are getting excited about it. It just has all these benefits to human health, to landscape health, to the climate. And again, this is the opportunity to do it. We're seeing, as you said, the amount of seeds being sold, people starting to grow their food. I do feel very excited by that, that connection is starting to be made, let alone the sort of the health benefits mentally around anxiety and all the studies that show that the more you've got your hands in the soil, the more benefits you're going to have to your own health and well-being. So what a great time where there's so much anxiety and uncertainty flying around to get out and put your hands in the soil and start growing food. And no, that's one of the simplest and the most healthy things you can do right now.
And also, I know you would agree that we also need to reconnect with farmers. So in every city, it's happening, you know, that people are starting, you know, community gardens, or even just having a few plants on your windowsill can be a great step forward. But we also need to be looking at that real food production and linking up with our farmers. And so we are, you know, very concerned about creating that balance between city and the region. And there I'm a bit concerned that we need to be sure that regen agriculture is linked to a systemic picture, which also talks about diversity, not just soil health. Because without the picture of diversity, which is linked to shorter transport links, we're missing an opportunity to reduce the plastic, the transport, and above all, be sure that regen agriculture doesn't end up becoming vast monocultures, as has happened with a lot of organic, a lot of biodynamic, that still fuels the supermarket economy and monoculture. Because, you know, you're saying with the pesticides, the minute you diversify, you reduce the need for external inputs of any kind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Profit and productivity. Yeah.
And that's what's really exciting is the, I didn't mention that, but all the farms I've been to that have done these regenerative practices, it's the biodiversity element that even the farmers are just stunned by, that once you put that life back in the soil, and then the dung beetles come back and the worms, and then that brings in the birds and the insects, and that brings in the larger birds, and then there's the water's flowing cleanly in the creek, so the platypus come back. It's just a beautiful story. And it's about how do we communicate these messages and say this is the way moving forward, that this small is beautiful. But also now that there's really strong evidence that there's profitability in there, even though that can be a dirty word, it can help those farmers to make that transition, because a lot of them are apprehensive. And the South Dakota State University did a study a couple of weeks ago that showed that they compared 20 regen farms to conventional plots and found that those farms were 78% more profitable because they were using less chemicals and inputs, and because there was a higher demand in the market for higher quality, healthier food. So what a beautiful incentive to get farmers to start taking that transition. And this is happening very, very quickly, not just in Australia, but right around the world. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as a result of, you know, things that have been slowed down now. But I hope that it'll make us not only self-care, but care for the landscapes that we have, or our own backyards. And certainly they're the discussions my wife and I are having. What are we growing in our backyard now? What are we choosing? Are we ramping it up so that we can be a little bit more self-sufficient than we were before? I think more and more people are going to have these questions, which is nothing but a good thing, I think.
Absolutely. I think, you know, as you probably know, we've been banging on about food and farming as the central vector for changing the world. You know, we've been banging on about that for 40 years, and it is happening, you know, and even before the word regen, in terms of what we call the local food movement, again, lots of evidence that if you plant diversity on one bit of land and monoculture on the other, you'll always be able to be more productive with diversity and do better financially. But of course, we need to also look at the hidden subsidies for monoculture and long distance, essentially subsidies for global corporation. And that's something that really needs to be part of the discussion, because I am convinced that around the world, if you ask people, do you want your taxes to subsidize diversified non-chemical foods from your country as opposed to monocultures using chemicals from the other side of the world, I have no doubt what the majority would vote for. But this is where tragically left and right have been blind to those fundamental issues of the real economy versus essentially the make-believe economy of money created as debt, you know. So
that's right. And it's interesting to look at those statistics that you'd probably be familiar with too, but it's something like just under 80% of the food we acquire comes from smaller holding farms. So, but we're only subsidizing the bigger companies, which are the big ag industries, which is only about just over 20% of our food. And that is largely soy and corn and sugar, and often they're fed to animals as well. So, you know, we should be subsidizing these smaller farms. This is the way to go. And again, I hope that that's part of this serious discussion we can have in the coming months about what are these key areas in our system that we can shift that are just going to have far-reaching benefits. And as you said, localized production. You know, I was reading yesterday about these stories of some of these Americans that are struggling to get some of their medications now because they were coming from China. Again, a great example of why aren't we producing them locally? Like another example. Or that when there was the huge hurricane in Puerto Rico last year, it wiped out the biggest factory in the world that make the IV bags for the saline, which now the world is short of because that factory was decimated with one climate change infected storm. So again, we're getting these signals about these large centralized systems aren't going to serve where we're at. And we're trying to adapt, these 21st century problems to a 20th century model. And we need to really have a serious discussion about what the 21st century model looks like. That is, these kind of shocks are built in because, as you know, they're not going to go anywhere. This is a bit of a dress rehearsal, this pandemic that we're having now. There are lots of sort of infectious disease experts saying that, we've known this is going to come for a while. They are going to keep coming in different ways. We know we're going to get climate shocks. So we've got to have a serious and adult conversation about what we want from our leadership, what kind of messaging do we want, how do we communicate that, and how do we prevent these kind of things from sort of bringing us to our knees again.
Yeah, and I was also just going to add, when you were talking about the agriculture, it's so important, particularly for Australia, to remember that the subsidies for water that go to these giants, again, we're using our taxes to subsidize toxic monocultures, a lot of them for export, a lot of them to feed, the animal factories, rather than reducing the need for water and diversifying, as you were saying earlier. So the exposing the subsidies is such an important part of it, because otherwise organic, regen, local food gets painted as elitist and as something, we don't care about the poor. No. All around the world, what's also wonderful to see is that communities are developing strategies for supporting people who can't afford to buy food at the farmers' markets. They're actually creating funds and various mechanisms that support people who are earning less money. But again, in the meanwhile, we should also be exposing the need for shifting subsidies.
Yeah, I mean, obviously my two experiences of deep diving research, looking at the food industry in particular and how much we subsidise them in Australia and how little tax they pay. And it's the same with the fossil fuel companies in this country. I mean, we subsidise them $29 billion and the majority of them don't pay any tax at all. So they're just very simple mechanisms that we have to address moving forward. I mean, even the bailout with Qantas is an interesting discussion. I think, $700 million has been pledged already. And Qantas hasn't paid tax for 10 years. Alan Joyce has earned about $24 million last year, and they put a freeze on their wages for their workers back in 2014. So really, let's have a serious discussion about who we're going to bail out moving forward, who actually needs the money, and how do we do it differently so that we learn the lessons from that post-GFC.
And that's the sort of two tracks, one that we try to urge people to look at. One of them is, what can I do right now to benefit myself and my local community and build up more resilient structures? But also, how can we keep that discussion going so we build a bigger movement for policy change? Simultaneously, we can do both. In terms of the local action, I'm also thrilled about various efforts to set up local funds to support this transition. So as I said, it's happening with food, it's happening with energy. We're going to talk later to Ella Goninan about that, also in Australia. And it's happening generally also with, even now in Byron, there's a group getting together to figure out how to fund really, useful and meaningful businesses in the area. I'm very keen that we encourage these efforts to happen at every level. I know projects, for instance, in Vermont, one where people who don't earn a lot of money, but who understand the need to localize, put $100 each in a joint pot to support meaningful projects, to help those who are less privileged, to start the transition to healthy food and energy, and also the financing and local businesses that are meaningful. So I'm just so glad that we're both in this area, Damon. There's a lot to do here. Yeah, there
is, and like I said, that group is called the Village Well, and it's just such a beautiful concept of getting people that can afford it to put some money into a fund with very low interest rates that actually lend to businesses that need it, that want to create community resilience, whether that's more water tanks or solar panel networks. That then, what a great down the track, if we're all shifting our money from these other banks to our local community bank, to know that any investment they're making is supporting and making our communities more resilient. I mean, that's the way forward. And there are these really interesting initiatives coming through. As you said, I spoke to a lady a couple of days ago in Perth who started a giving circle and they've been doing it around girls' education, that people contribute whatever they can in a year, whether it's $100 or $200. And at the end of that year, they collate all that money, put it to a panel to sort of work out some of the best solutions that are around the world. And then the people get to decide where their money goes. And it's millions of dollars that they've accrued now. And that's just the combination of small amounts of money on an individual level, how big an impact that can have collectively. So I think these kind of ideas are suddenly become common sense in a lot of ways. And Charles talks about this in his books, that, the more things start to fall apart, radical ideas can become common sense very quickly. And I think we're going to see that in the months ahead, that things that weren't even considered or laughed at probably 6 months ago we'll be able to have serious conversations, because I'm sure, as you're noticing, all these things that we thought were so set and rigid, I just feel so much in flux right now. I just feel like we're seeing the illusory nature of our system, and the fact that all these flights can stop and all these people can be grounded. It just shows us what we are capable of, that there is nothing solid about our system.
It's when we come together, as a society, but also again at the local level, the really small funds to just ordinary individuals coming together are very important. And I think we need to recognize that many of them, in order to help launch a really healthy direction, again, particularly around food and affordable housing, vital too, trying to create a community group that can support these things, very often needs philanthropy rather than an investment. In order to actually get the ball rolling, we want to encourage philanthropic donations to start that regeneration in our local area. And you were saying radical ideas. It's so interesting that so much of this completely transcends what people think of as radical. The idea of helping out in your community and getting healthy, fresh food for everyone. What's radical about that? It's truly wonderful that we have a message that can completely reach beyond left and right.
That's right. Yeah, I'm conscious, Helena. I know that we're, in these times, that rather than you and I just talking, are you okay if we open it up to questions now?
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
Community discussion is really important. I think if Henry, you're okay with that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Damon. I'm having, trying to pick out all the threads in the different questions. There is still a lot of stuff coming up, despite the fact that we talked about this in the last hour. There's a lot of stuff coming up about what is the best way we can have these conversations in this time. When China is back up and running, and the world will start the machinations of industry very quickly again. What will happen then? How can we actually leverage the time that we have right now and the situation that we have to build practical movements for change making, and especially local food and agriculture, perhaps even specifically in our area?
Yeah, I mean, that's a terrific question and tricky. And I actually saw a really disappointing graph a couple of days ago that showed that the nitrogen dioxide over China went down dramatically for 6 weeks, but even in the last 4 or 5 days, it started to come back again to pre-corona levels. So this is the reality of what we're going to face. I think we can't be too idealistic about that our system has so much inertia that people are going to want to jump back very quickly because of that debt problem, because of the panic. I know friends of ours that have got industries that rely heavily on China. They're not having these discussions that we're having right now. They're talking about how do they not lose their businesses? How do they start manufacturing more of their products? So it's a very tricky time to have these discussions, but I think that there is an opportunity to have them. And I've already been having them with people that weren't open to this before. So I think it's vital that what Helena's doing in these kind of conferences, we just have to keep them going, and we have to broaden the circle and have wider and wider conversations. What can you do in your own community? How can you connect with your own neighbours to work out how you localize your food or your energy or even your conversations, the materials you use? I'm very excited by these library of things that are popping up around the world now. In the same way we share books, people are starting to set up these communal meeting places for appliances and lawnmowers and waffle makers and things that we don't use all the time, that can only use every now and again. And then people are volunteering to repair those and rent them and run them. So these things are already happening. They're only going to get amplified with what's going on right now. So I think trying to control the bigger system is very overwhelming and challenging. The best thing we can do is focus on our individual area, our community, our family, our workplace, and try to instill the changes at that level right now. And then I think we can transfer some of that learning and information to the bigger system when the time is right in the coming months.
Well, I guess I would say I would urge people to come to our website, localfutures.org, if you don't know that already, and look there at our Planet Local series, lots of examples of things that are happening. You know, one of the problems is that most people who are so worried about surviving now and whether they're exporting to China or whether they're just worried about their job have not been exposed to a whole movement. First of all, there's a broader new economy movement, but within that, the localization movement, the local economy movement, is vast. It's across the world and it's demonstrating viable alternatives. Most people don't know about that, and that's the problem. So once they wake up to the fact that there is actually a whole paradigm and there's a reality, this is not just theory, there's a reality on the ground of things that are happening, proving that we can, for instance, with local food, increase productivity while we reduce the human ecological footprint. And with that, we're talking about reducing the plastic, the emissions, the transport, the pesticides, the fungicides, preservative. We're talking about restoring health to ecosystems and people. And this is part of an economic trajectory. But of course, within economics, agriculture is not even recognized. Recently in England, the high-level expert, Tim Lernig is his name, came up with a big report saying, agriculture only contributes 1% to GDP. Let's stop farming. Let's just be like Singapore and import all our food. This is in England. He's suggesting that England should stop farming entirely because it doesn't register within his econometric thinking. So the reality on the ground is that the food economy and its transition is the most fundamental, the most important, and it is happening. It's being demonstrated. And along with that, the community building, the business alliances, all of that, the most important thing we can do is to educate ourselves deeply and fully on that and our neighbors so that we can start creating these new initiatives. Many of them will have to wait until we're out of social isolation. But right now we could be having such fruitful discussions and exchanges about what sort of things we want to implement later on. And as Damon was saying, right now we can start with some of the food growing right at home. I was also suggesting that we can be outside meeting and talking and singing, and playing music. There are all kinds of ways that, at least in Australia right now, we can be meeting outside if we keep the social distance at the couple of meters apart. So yeah, I hope that people will look at our website and look at, we have blogs as well as the Planet Local series that provide a lot of information.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add too, Helena, that in the coming probably days, if not week, for people that are living in the sort of Byron, Mullum, Bangalow area, there is the sort of Byron Resilience group are going to launch a website just with a lot of different resources to help people and guide them to actions they can take right now. It's going to be a bit of a soft launch, but at least set up a space for sharing those kind of ideas.
Awesome. Good to know about that. We're thinking about a similar thing, Helena and I, discussing the idea of a localization hub that's specifically around food. And we're going to send you more about that, send everyone who's part of this discussion more about that after the call. Might not be immediately after.
No,
not immediately, but
next week or
that's
so.
together.
Yeah.
We have a question from Aiden. I'm trialing turning on his mic so he can ask it himself to you guys. Mm-hmm. Aiden, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool. Let's give it a red hot go then. So my question was around, I guess, reconciling the local with the global. I'll just read out what I wrote down. So given the centrality of the profit motive, so the extraction of surplus value in capitalism, is it possible to reconcile any form of capitalism and the environment? So can we do, quote, better capitalism, end quote, such as impact banking for funding regenerative agriculture? Or do you think we need some kind of post-capitalism?
Cool. Thanks, Aidan.
Do you want to go first, Damon, or shall I?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to work with what we've got right now, that we can have that discussion, but the idea that we can just start to suddenly end a system would be even more chaotic than what we're facing right now. That I think we have so much inertia, as I said, in this current system, that how do we adapt its current forms to what we're dealing with right now? And as you said, these kind of localized banks, the food networks, local currencies, to me, that's the smart, sensible transition element. And then it puts us in a position that we can have the larger discussion about what is the next system, what does it look like. There's no doubt it has to be a different system. As I said before, we've got to move from competition and rivalry to interconnected and symbiotic relationships with the planet and each other and our ecosystems. We absolutely stand at a precipice right now. We're consuming about 100 billion metric tons of resources every year. That's forests and timbers and fish and plastics and metals. The Earth can only sustain 50 billion. And we're on track for 180 billion by 2050. So that wipes out most living things. So people don't understand deeply, enough people understand how urgent that is. But I think we can't expect to suddenly transition very quickly unless it's through a crisis. We have to just use what we've got, modify it, be more sensible with it. How can it benefit more people? How do we have more people owning and having a stake in things? How do we shut down this sort of rentier philosophy? How do we create more interconnected networks? That's the first logical step, from my opinion. And then we have the really big discussion about what our next system looks like. But, you know, that's not going to happen immediately.
Well, I would argue that the capitalist system that we know started with global trade and global banks expanding across the world. And it was, you know, literally linked to genocide and slavery and later on colonialism. It forced people away from a diversified, more self-reliant economy where groups of people were interdependent with each other and with their resources. They developed strategies for how to organize themselves, not all of them perfect by any means, but the capitalist system that we're critiquing, many of us, is fundamentally a global system. So I would argue that we need to recognize that that globalizing path was reinforced dramatically after the Second World War with trade treaties, with the setting up not only of the World Bank and the IMF, but the GATT, and that GATT was a general agreement on tariffs and trade. It was handing the world over to global corporations. Many well-intentioned people joined that. They wanted to avoid another world war. They wanted to avoid another depression. And they rolled out the red carpet for global businesses and banks to essentially infiltrate and control economic activity across the entire world. And a lot of so that got further reinforced from the 80s onward. So from about the mid-80s until recently, we had a series of trade treaties where governments are bowing down in the front of corporations, writing in black and white, we will not do anything that would inhibit your profit-making potential. We agree, you can sue us if we do that. The courts in which governments are sued are kangaroo courts. This is a situation that it's not a secret. It's open, but most people are not seeing it. It's so far removed. And my conviction is that our biggest problem today is blindness to the workings of the global market and the global capitalist system, equal blindness to the fact that at the local level, the human scale level, where communities come together, where they know and see each other, they know the trees on the mountain, they know the stream that runs near them, they could never in a million years develop an idiotic indicator like GDP. It wouldn't be possible. Because GDP goes up when there's more illness and more clear cutting. It goes up when our water is so poisoned that we have to buy it in bottles. At a more local level, at a more human scale level, that's impossible. So I am convinced that at a policy level, the first step will be pressure from the grassroots to take back the power from a de facto global government of interlinked corporations and banks through new trade treaties that give corporations a chance to decide, am I going to be American or Japanese? I am not going to be allowed to blackmail governments and tell them to do as I say. I'm going to have to listen to democratically agreed regulations that I have to adhere to. Right now, those global players are being deregulated and subsidized, and they don't pay tax, almost none of them, or very, very little. And in the meanwhile, every other business and bank and us as individuals are being squeezed by heavy regulations and more heavy taxation. That imbalance, that injustice is the absolutely first thing to deal with in order to come back to, I believe we could call it capitalism if we say, yes, it's fine if some people work harder, they can earn some more, we can have some saving, we can have some interest, but all within democratically determined bounds. At the local level right now, we can establish systems that show the benefits of this community-based, visible, accountable way of interacting with one another and with our precious water and soil, the real economy. So within the capitalist critique, I would argue that the deep ecological and the deep spiritual reality of the need for connection to nature in order to maintain life, the need to connect to one another in order to have a sense of true interdependence, that deeper spiritual and ecological wisdom is generally not included in the dominant critique of capitalism. So I would argue that localism ultimately is the ism that will end all isms. I don't believe in one system. I believe in coming back to diversity and understanding that they will be different in different countries, different regions, different locales. But the process of decentralization and subsidiarity, particularly in basic needs like food, water, shelter, clothing, there's no reason why most regions shouldn't be allowed to produce what they need for themselves. Sorry to go on at such length.
I was just going to say that the challenge we have there, Helena, is that's we understand that and we love that, but we have gatekeepers of a narrative and the story that's being told at the moment that is very opposed to this, and the discussions are already happening about let's cut more taxation, let's cut red tape to get out of this crisis. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to understand that we have great power to contribute to the collective consciousness through everything we post. Everything we share right now is more important than ever. And we have one man and one company who controls about 60% of our newspapers in this country. We have a leading radio jock who has a vested interest in the status quo. All our mainstream media channels are owned by extractive industries. We actually have to do this and tell the stories ourselves and share this information more than we ever have, because we're up against a huge barrier. And that's why I made 2040. I know that's why Helena made her films. But it's not up to just us as storytellers. We're all storytellers right now, and we have to be really vigilant with what we're contributing.
Exactly, and that's what I call big picture activism. In other words, the most important activism today is to share that bigger picture, that holistic view of what's going on, and that bigger system that's impinging on all of us, and the deeper grassroots understanding, because that development of that whole local movement across the world is also invisible. We're dealing with these invisible structures, both the tentacles of the strings that are pulling us from the global market and the reality of what's happening on the ground. So making that visible, educating ourselves, educating others, big picture activism is where the action is today.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, a lot of people who have discovered the deep truth of interconnectedness, of the oneness of life, of the permanent change of life, who discovered spiritual tradition, they ended up often focusing just on the inner transition. But now that needs to translate into what does that consciousness mean in terms of the structures and how we live. And it comes back to a smaller human scale. It comes back to diversity.
I just unmuted Anthony, who's got a pretty cool question. I'm wondering, Anthony, sorry, I didn't check with you before. I couldn't figure out how to do it, but are you okay to read out that question yourself?
Yeah, sure. It's, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, it's, I just heard you both, I realise you both live in the Northern Rivers, as do I. And you're both speaking about similar initiatives around food and food resilience. And I wondered, you know, rather than doubling up or reinventing the wheel, if we could create an umbrella organisation / group, kind of like Extinction Rebellion did. You know, they were really successful with what they did about a year ago, and that it is national, state, regional, local, but we're all sharing. And it's, I don't know if you've heard of a concept called collective impact. Collective impact is a thing that was studied by Stanford University about addressing large-scale social issues like this. And it's about getting people together with a common cause and a backbone organisation, which is actually structured. And so I wondered if you had considered that and if you'd like to comment on that in general.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony.
Great question, Anthony. That's exactly the discussions that we're having at the moment behind the scenes. It's been done with a little bit of trepidation because, again, there's so much out there right now. What's that fine line between adding yet another group that are trying to do something? So we're really trying to not double up and make sure we're amplifying other people that are doing terrific work. Even our local council here, instead of setting up a group, are we better served to actually help the council right now and see what they can do? So those chats are being had. It's a wonderful idea. Helena mentioned before that Local Futures are thinking of doing something similar. I agree, we need to combine powers there and have a serious conversation so we're not just providing too many different options. But you're right, it's a very delicate one because there are pros and cons with starting something right now in that space. Everyone's trying to do it. But yes, it's happening. There is something that'll be launched for our local area probably this week. And then let's see what happens to it from there. If it gets enough support, then we can turn it into something else. Let's see which one organically catches fire, and then we can sort of use that to amplify the messages.
Also, I'm wondering, I remember I worked with an economist years ago, and I was saying, I thought it was so sad that there were all these different groups basically working in the same direction, but working independently, and that we should all be linked up. But he said to me, no, Helena, this is part of our message. He was the first economist to take local seriously, someone named Richard Douthwaite. He said, no, actually, it's better that they remain more independent and flexible. But as long as we can share the information and the vision, I get the impression that there are a lot of contenders, as you say, Damon, who want to be that umbrella. And I think we need to be careful that we don't invest too much energy in wanting to be the umbrella rather than getting on with, you know, both the big picture activism and starting to implement change. And so yeah, I think ideally there would be one central place to go, but I suspect that we won't actually end up with that because there are too many egos, there are too many contenders who want to be the overarching thing. So I'm very happy with Local Futures. I'm based here to contribute and be part of these things, and we do have a lot on our website. 2040 does too. There's the Renew Festival, and I know Ella wants to do a lot more with that, also as an umbrella for genuine grassroots community work, and we'll be talking to her later. So there's a great diversity, and just trying to stay informed and spreading the word is what we all need to do, I think.
One of my favourite quotes, Elena, when I was doing some research for the film was, someone said that, you know, the world will only change when the people that want to do it are happy to not take credit for it. Yeah. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about. We just need to surrender egos right now, amplify whoever's doing the best things, learn from that, share their thing. Let's not try and be the ones to own the transition.
Yeah.
Ella's written a couple of things around finance there, Henry. Is Ella's mic able to come off?
Ella Goninen.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Ella.
Hey, hi.
Hi.
Oh, we can see you too.
Yeah, hi.
She's going to be on later, that's why.
Yeah, it's really on my mind at the moment, the super social injustice of the economic imbalance amongst us as a people. And also listening to people in the 1% really wanting to do big change. And, you know, and you know, when I think of the 1%, I'm thinking about people that have so much money that even if they gave the majority of it away, they wouldn't even notice a change in their daily living in any way at all. They could still have their private schools, still have their assets, still have so much more wealth than the majority of us. why, you know, like, unless we're really, in my mind, getting super real on that conversation inside these circles of discussing what do we do, you know, the imbalance of talking about solutions if we want to maintain a 1%. I just like, yeah, clearly I'm bamboozled, and part of it is I think it's really hard to take off the muzzle that is the capitalist, colonialist muzzle that doesn't want us to speak to this, because at the 99% mark, if you're inside that, you are frightened to not have stakeholder relationships anymore, or, you know, be able to relate with the people that apparently help us make the change. So yeah, I'd love to hear from that. And I also want to just transparently say that I'm assuming both you, Helena, and Damon are at least close to the 1%, if not in it yourself. So I'd be super curious.
I make documentaries, Ella. I make documentaries. I've got no income for the next 3 months.
No way.
That's really mystify my presumption, and really good to hear. Like, I just and not laugh about it. I also just want to acknowledge that I've been challenged as someone putting on an event to do it for free before, and both of you have said that to me, that I should put that event on for free. And
I've said that you should put on the event.
Like in earlier years, I have been said, why can't you put on a massive event and have it free to the public? And I think people that understand money must understand the fact that these things, they cost. We're in an economic...
Let me respond, Ella, because you've made a big accusation to me there, which I absolutely...
Well, a big question, not an accusation.
No, but I would never have suggested... I'm in the arts myself. I know how hard it is to try and raise money to make a film, and I completely support your festival, and I would never, sorry if that was misconstrued, ever suggest you do that for free. What I would say is that I completely agree with you. I've been in circles recently with lots of very multimillionaires, billionaires, and this question has come up, the crux is they all want to do the right thing. They want to invest in the right areas. But as the documentary maker in the film, with no shares in anything or nothing to lose in that sense, I've said, what is the problem with you giving up that money? And the way people freeze up and get tense when they own more and they have more money and there is more to lose, this is a huge problem that we face. Even when we were talking about, could you invest in some of the solutions that we've shown in 2040, the Seaweed, the Regen Ag, even if it wasn't a 10% return, but it was a 6% return, they would still say no and balk at that. So this is a huge issue that we've got to face. And that's why I think we can spend a lot of time trying to convince those people to change, but they're not going to give up what they have right now. We have to address the fundamental structural issues that allows them to accrue that much more money in the first place. And that's the more important conversation, I think, that this rentier economy we've created, that they can make all this money off not really doing anything but owning properties or shifting shares and illusory digits around the world. That is a flaw in our system that has to be addressed. So, yeah, I think it's important that we stay tight with each other and support each other, and that I'm certainly in your corner 100%, and in choosing to volunteer and use my time, which I think is the most important thing right now, more than money. How can I help out certain groups, the council, volunteer, help my friends with cafes deliver the food, whatever it is outside of a money paradigm, how can I offer other services that aren't financial in this moment? I hope that gives some clarity.
I think, Damon, can I just add this in with a question that was asked here? Damon's points on the structural genesis of so much of the inequality. A question that Arndt asked was, how do we get the mainstream media to pick up on the tax evasion of big companies in Australia to ensure that the masses are awake to this and that the government acts accordingly? And he also ties that into how we could get this entire conversation outside of whatever bubble we might be in right now to include, to really speak to the majority of the population.
Helena, did you want to say something first?
Oh, well, yes, I just want to say to Ella that no, it's ridiculous to think that we're in the 1%. I have given my life, basically, not to being concerned about earning living, a small amount of money that my husband and I inherited, and basically I've donated my whole life to trying to bring about change. So it's quite heavy accusation. And also, as Damon was saying, right now, if I were to give, away the little bits of money that we have so that we would be struggling, I don't think that would help very much. I've managed to run a very small organization on almost, thin air. And I certainly absolutely never said to you, run it for free. I think I was questioning, as some people were, whether it wouldn't be possible to do it for less money. And you at that point were arguing that they pay it at rock festivals and so on. So why shouldn't they for a Renew festival? And I was just worried that you wouldn't be able to bring in enough money. So, and as you know, we ended up charging for this conference and even for this webinar, because we totally know that we need to bring in some money to do things. And it's, as you can see, publicly available, in terms of salaries and so on that we're able to pay and how we use the money. It's remarkable that we're able to do as much as we do, because it's on very, very little money. But also, more importantly, what Damon was saying, we really must be spending our time now trying to understand how it is that in every single country, the gap between rich and poor is widening obscenely in every country, in China, in Bhutan, in Sweden. And people still often romanticize the Scandinavian countries because they haven't studied the global economy enough. They haven't seen how the global corporations have managed to pressure governments in Scandinavia as well in the disastrously wrong direction. There's still a little more, money for even science in the public interest, health in the public interest, but it's shrinking because of this terrible dynamic. And let's remember that. No regulations, no taxes for the giant monopolies. That is the main reason why we have this obscene gap. So let's try to work together to change that. And whether we work side by side with billionaires who are willing to look at really changing the system, or people from the grassroots who have no money, or whether we're talking about people who are indigenous or non-indigenous from every area, all of us are being harmed by that system that not only widens the gap between rich and poor, but is systematically destroying life itself. We all must come together from every area to really look at that systemic change, which I know is what you're working on.
A few points that I want to try and tie in here. There's questions about universal basic income and also an income cap, and whether or not you guys think that that's a good idea. There was a question about whether localization can scale enough to deal with the international problems that we're facing, deal with a global problem like climate change. What part does localization play in those international conversations that have to happen? Can it achieve that?
I think that's enough, Henry. I mean, those are already a bit separate. So why don't we?
Yeah, they are a little separate.
Damon,
I can quickly. I'll let you do the localization. I'll just say, I did quite a lot of research into the universal basic income, and initially I was actually quite apprehensive about it, just because I thought it could be a band-aid solution that wouldn't address the structural issues. That if we suddenly just gave people a check, it would erode healthcare issues. It would erode other social safety networks. I was a bit nervous about that. But since this has happened, it's crying out for how desperately it is needed, that we just need to have that sort of security for people. Often what comes up is, how do we pay for that? I think that's almost a laughable question, in the sense that, Trump can just do $1 trillion stimulus package right now for America. He can just create that money and generate it. We know there's about $18 trillion hid in offshore tax havens right now around the world. Let's start making some of the people accountable for that. Let's get these people to start paying their tax, some of these large corporations. Let's at least stop subsidizing. We'd create billions, if not trillions of dollars in that area as well. And I really like the idea that someone suggested that a way to actually pay universal basic income and also address climate would be to create a revenue neutral dividend, much like Alaska does. Alaska charges a penalty to the big corporations for digging oil, and that money doesn't go to the government. It goes straight back to the people as a dividend. They get a check every month So what a great way to suddenly put a price on carbon emissions as well, right around the world, start actually penalising these companies for polluting our atmosphere or other industries, and then use that money to actually pay a universal basic income for people right around the world while we're healing the environment at the same time. It feels like there's the opportunity to have that serious discussion right now as well. Helene, I'll let you talk about localisation and climate change.
Yeah, I would also just say in terms of universal basic income, I would want to see it linked to a bigger package. And I think it's not going to happen anyway without enormous pressure from the grassroots. And then that pressure from the grassroots might as well deal with this systemic trajectory that we're talking about. So as part of a bigger package, absolutely, absolutely needed. In terms of scaling up localization at one level means place-based business and economic activity, that every business needs to be registered in a democratically accountable arena and adhere to the rules determined by society. So certainly at the level I was talking about before, that we have new trade treaties that demand basically as an economic entity, you can't be trading countries off against each other and say, oh, you're giving me a better deal, cheaper labor, cheaper resources, no restrictions, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to abandon you who have a few rules. So that first step is to insist that every business is place-based, at first at the national level. But we can simultaneously be visioning, and it's happening, lobbying central governments for more decentralization, even from the national nation-state level. Because when it comes to food, when it comes to determining genuinely healthy regulations for public health and welfare, we need a huge rethink to look at what could work in a meaningful way to restore healthy ecosystems and to restore genuine health to people. So we have done some writing. Again, my book, Local is Our Future, talks about some of this. But scaling up is something that we need to rethink this idea that everything has to be big to be effective. Even as we were talking earlier about having an umbrella organization in Byron, it may not be as effective as several smaller groups that are able to interact and be more flexible and more effective by not being too big. And even at the local level, you can end up sitting at meetings for days, just talking, and getting on with the action can be much more difficult. So to scaling up, let's remember that replication, a way of helping people, whether it's farmers or businesses or local governments or local cities. We work with several cities around the world that are now implementing localization policies. Whether we do that or not, we do not want to link them all up into some scaled up structure. We want them to have a linked up big picture so that they have more clarity about which path into the future they're supporting, the one away from nature, away from community, or towards nature, towards community. So I think localization as an absolute necessity for restoring the deep knowledge and wisdom where we can truly appreciate the diversity of the living world. That is absolutely essential. And that's going to mean decentralization, and the scaling up will be through replication, not through creating centralized systems.
If I might just add, Helena, you often talk about international collaboration being fostered by localization, as in more grassroots collaboration rather than just big businesses that are mobile collaborating internationally.
Yes, actually that we need definitely to be scaling up the vision and the collaboration and information exchange, and that's happening already at the grassroots. That needs to happen much more. And as we pressure our national governments to sit at the table to negotiate new treaties about what kind of economy do we want. And so we're talking about politics and economy. There is no real democracy without some kind of economic power. They're completely linked. And today we are being run basically by big business. We have a de facto interlinked government or empire or global corporation.
So finally, to wrap up, a question that is always bubbling. I use the word bubbling because it's about bubbles. And that is, how do we get this conversation beyond what we might conceive of as an ideological bubble, what are your ways of reaching out, and what can people do to bring this message to other people in their lives?
Make a feature film. That's what I'd do. Make a documentary. That's what I recommend. But no, again, as I said before, we all have that power. We all, you know, we have our own publishing stations every day. What are we sharing? Let's be really vigilant with what are we contributing to in the collective sense? Are we sharing solutions and ideas that excite people and get them going? Or are we contributing to a paralyzing fear narrative that shuts people down? This is it. There's so much of that out there right now. How do we actually offer something different as an individual? Propose these solutions. This is the time to plant those ideas, plant the seeds in people's minds that never would have contemplated this before, because we are in a flux state right now, and everything's on the table. This is the moment to start suggesting those ideas. So that's what I'm going to be doing personally, more research into some systemic changes and local ideas and solutions, and I'll be sharing those and just getting people discussing them and thinking about them and just planting them in the collective consciousness. I think that's the crucial thing you can do right now.
I would also add to that it's really important to consider the language we use and to try, first of all, to appeal to people across various divisions right now. We are really suffering from a dominant narrative that keeps us divided. And that's, you know, the rich-poor narrative, it's the different races, the gender discussion, at every level. A divisive narrative. We need to be looking at how can we be telling stories that unite us and that bring us together. And that's not to deny the importances of some of those differences, or the, you know, the very real, you know, rights for people to be lobbying for instance, women's rights, indigenous people's rights, and so on. But if we can link it to that bigger picture, we will see, we can show that whatever your concern, and whether you're concerned about a particular group in society, or whether you're concerned about a particular environmental issue, whether it's dolphins or trees or plastic, every single issue you care about has either been created by the dominant economic system, when you understand that system in its wholeness, or it's being exacerbated by it. And even if that's not true, then whatever you care about and what you're fighting for is going to see that there's less and less money available for your particular issue, unless we link together into this new economy transition framing. If we do that, we will all stand to win. So I think really important to try to tone down the language. You know, I'm saying to some of my feminist friends, perhaps use language that won't be a bit of a red flag for men. I'm talking, as I will be later, to Ella Bancroft about also having a uniting picture where Indigenous people can work along non-Indigenous people to have that returning back to nature. So I would say both less inflammatory, basic truths about the need for connection to one another, the intergenerational connection, the connection to the plants, to the animals around us, to the need for everyone to have a meaningful livelihood. We can be talking about jobs and livelihoods to everybody, to have security, to have proper health care. So we can really have a very broad and very uniting framing. And the other thing I would say too is to try to keep the language as non-technical, non-academic as possible, to make it available as broadly as possible.
Yep.
Awesome, thank you guys. Before we wrap up, Damon, is there any last words you'd like to say? After this, we're gonna have our lunch break. We've been sitting in front of computers for 2 hours almost. So thank you all for your engagement and for your interest. Yep. Damon, is there anything you want to say to wrap us up?
I just thank you both for putting this together, and thanks for everyone for joining. This is the time to come together and have discussions, and even for Ella for her bravery to even raise that issue. I know that could have been challenging, and but it's all important. We've got to be able to hold the space for all these conversations. So thank you, even Ella, for raising that, and for everyone for being a part of this. Let's just stick together. We're on the same team. Let's get through this and come out of this in a better shape than we are right now.
Awesome. I want to thank you, Damon, also for your brilliance and your command of all these statistics as well. I don't know many of my colleagues who are as hardworking as you are. I've seen you read every single book I gave you. I've seen you really do an unbelievable amount of work to put together 2040. So lots of respect and love, Damon. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody.